This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, mega orderers. The world looks pretty disordered right now. The Assad regime, which has ruled Syria since 1970, has just collapsed, literally melted away without its core forces fighting for it. Its regional allies, Iran and Hezbollah, its global ally, Russia, abandon it. And then, most critically, its loyal foot soldiers from the sectarian group on which the regime is based, the Alawites, simply collapsed. They didn't fight. Not even hundreds of people were killed. But yet in the Syrian civil war from 2011 to the present, more than 500,000 people were killed on both sides. And mostly it was the Alawite regime doing the killing. So they weren't willing to kill to defend the regime in the final analysis. Why is that? I'm going to jump in with some historical musings from my time living in Syria when I was there on my Fulbright in 2004-05. And then we're going to go to a pre-recorded episode with Arthur Snell that we recorded last week on Wednesday, the 3rd of December, about Syria and Georgia and everything else. Because that's not hyper-topical now, because events have moved so quickly, we're inserting these musings of mine, and then we're going to revisit this all with Jane Kinnenmont on Thursday, who's out in the Gulf at high-level meetings on Syria. And she and I are going to have hyper-topical but historical background discussion. The mainstream media has been focusing on why did Russia or Iran not defend the regime? Why did they withdraw their special forces? What I think the main story is that's not being covered is, why is it that a sectarian regime which took power in 1966 under Salah al-Jadid, and it came to power because during the Mandate period, the French favored minorities to receive higher military training, Christians as well as Ismailis and Druze, but Alawites in specific. So Alawites being only between 8 and 12% of the Syrian population, were 20, 30, 40% of the top military people in the French Mandate, and then they had a plurality of the generals and elite military positions. And after Salah Jadid's coup in 1966, generals and intelligence officers in Ba'athist Syria were majority Alawite. It was the Alawite dominance over the intelligence services and the military services that was how Syria was governed. In Arabic, this is known as ta'ifiyya, sectarianism. In other words, Sunnis, they're the majority population. We are afraid of them. Let them do their commerce and their work and their farming. But we, the minorities, need to specialize in certain things. And that's why in 1982, when there was a massive Islamist uprising, Sunnis and Hama were ruthlessly crushed by Alawites. Alawites were willing to kill 30,000 civilians because they looked at other Syrians, Sunni Syrians, as not from their own. This is also how the 2011 Arab Spring in Syria was able to be repressed differently than in North Africa. Because in North Africa, the majority of the opponents of the regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, the opponents of the regime were Sunni, and the security forces of the regime were Sunni. And at some point, the thugs of the regime simply didn't want to fire into the crowd where they were killing their own. They were just killing the unemployed and the youth from their own group. As a result, there was a degree of force that even the Gaddafian state could not bring against its own people. The war in Syria post-2011 was an apocalyptic hellscape because the Assad regime and its Alawite dominant stormtroopers, particularly the Mahir Brigade, named after Assad's brother, were willing to destroy civilian areas, to barrel bomb Aleppo. This was possible because they felt that their group, the Alawites, were under a genocidal threat from Sunni insurgents. Why? Alawites are viewed by hardcore Sunni Islamists as non-Muslim. They practice takfir towards the Alawites. They say Alawites are not Muslim. They are kafirs. This is based on the 1215 fatwa of Ibn Taymiyyah, which explains that the Alawites are essentially polytheists. And as someone who, in his first attempt at the doctorate, studied Alawites, not just French policy towards them, but Alawite theology, I can tell you that Alawism is in fact polytheism. So long story short, because Alawism is polytheism, and it is ghulat, which is the deification of Ali, there has always been a strong case for Sunni jihadis to say Alawites are kafirs, you can take their women, you can kill them. This threat of genocidal violence at the hands of either ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra, and now of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was supposed to be the motivation to have the 10,000+ strong Alawite security services, elite Alawite security services, fight and do whatever is needed to oppose the rebels. But they didn't. They melted away. First, they didn't defend Aleppo. Then, okay, Hama will fall because Hama's a mostly Sunni city and it's always been against the regime. But why did the Alawite neighborhoods of Homs not fight? And then why did the elite security services in Damascus take off their uniforms, not fight at all, abandon their vehicles, and flee? This is not just because Russia and Iran wasn't supporting them. This is another dynamic, which is that the leaders of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, particularly Jolani himself, must have convinced the intelligence services and the elite security services of the Assad regime, if Assad goes, we will not exact revenge against your community. Just abandon Assad now, and you're going to be safe. We're not jihadis anymore, and we don't care about the fact that standard Al-Qaeda and ISIS theology considers the Alawites as kafirs. So some backroom deals were cut, and I guess a lot of Alawite elites have fled to their mountain. And this is the area that I spent a lot of time in 2004-05. I had my famous bee sting where I had a theological conversation about how Ali is the king of the bees, because in Alawite theology you say, Ali huwa amir al-nahl. He is the king of the bees, and he gathers the honey from everywhere. And when I was having this conversation after my bee sting, this guy is like, you're doing taqiyya. You are dissimulating to not be an Alawite, but you're actually an Alawite. Do you work for the Syrian government? I was like, no, man, I just am a graduate student, dude. But I've spent a lot of time in those Alawite mountains, and I never would have thought that the day would come where they would not fight to defend their neighborhoods, because it is this asabiya of the Alawite minority. And asabiya is Ibn Khaldun's term for group solidarity. It is the asabiya of the Alawites, which from 1966 under Salah Jadid, from 1970 to 2000 under Hafiz al-Assad, and then this period from 2001 to 2024, it is Alawite Asabiya, group solidarity, which has kept the Assad regime in power. So when all this mainstream media says, the Russians abandoned them, Hezbollah abandoned them, of course the regime would fall, that's missing it. How is it that the rebels convinced the Alawites that they were safe and that they could flip sides? And then how is it that their Asabiya dissipated? And maybe the only answer is to go back to Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, the most famous Muslim sociologist, some say the grandfather of sociology for the whole world, he understood that Asabiya decreases over time, and that kids and grandkids of people who fought to win a regime and to defend a regime gradually don't believe in it anymore. This may be the answer. The economic situation had gotten so bad, the corruption was so disgusting that all of Syria's wealth was taken outside, and regime elites benefited while mainstream Alawites, even if they fought in the security services, lived lives of quiet desperation where they themselves were frequently killed. And maybe they just said, this is enough. We're not going to die to defend the Rami Makhloufs And he's a famous Syrian oligarch who's connected to some mobile telecom billionaire companies. They just weren't willing to fight to defend that, and they no longer believed that they would be genocided. So that's the story. It's a story of declining Alawite Asabiya. The rest is all a detail, I would argue. We recorded this episode initially, Arthur and I, on Wednesday of last week. Obviously, some bits of the discussion are dated. We are going to still play you most of that discussion. We are going to be looking at today the Israeli-Lebanese ceasefire, the fall of Aleppo, the Georgian election, and then some things which might not even be on your horizon, like the Irish election, and the crisis in South Korea with attempted imposition of martial law and then popular protests and the government having to back down, and something that we thought was not going to happen, the pardoning of Hunter Biden. So, as the world prepares for the inauguration of Trump and peak disorder, I am really looking forward to breaking it down with Arthur Snell, our occasional co-host and our generalist extraordinaire. Arthur, how does the world look to you right now?
Well, Jason, great to be with you again. As the chaos was unfolding in South Korea, the president apparently thinking that he could ignore Parliament, declare martial law, I found myself tweeting half in jest but half seriously a polite request to world leaders that if they were going to perform unexpected and unprecedented actions, could they at least leave a few days between one and the other? Because there just seems to be so much happening at the moment that it's almost impossible to stay ahead of what's going on.
But this is what I've been writing about and you've been forecasting for years now, which is that in the absence of stable American and Western hegemony, disorder ping-pongs from one location to another, and the Russians are doing things that affect the Georgian election. So a South Korean autocrat thinks that he might be able to get away with canceling the democratic tradition in his country. It is connected, right?
Absolutely. And I was very struck by the thought that were President Trump not about to be inaugurated, I don't think any president of South Korea would experiment with breaking up democracy, which, of course, as anyone who's been following the recent history of that country will know, democracy in South Korea is a relatively recent, relatively fragile creation.
Critically, it's an American implant. And like in Japan, you might argue that those societies, the East Asian tigers, have taken the good aspects of our economic model and the good aspects of our institutional checks and balances and a culture of democracy and made it better than we even have it at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we all know, in the first Trump presidency, he was toying with the idea of withdrawing all military support to South Korea. So any East Asian politician who is existing in late 2024, knowing that a Trump presidency is imminent, is looking at that kind of context.
As exciting as South Korea is, though, I want to lead with that part of the world which is near and dear to our heart, Arthur, and that's the Levant. The fattoush there is crispy, the muhammara is spicy, and the kebab bil karaz, which is the lamb kebab with cherry sauce famous in Aleppo, is divine, right? So absolutely. How are these things all connected? Because listeners may not grasp how Israel battering Hezbollah has now restarted the Syrian civil war, and the ceasefire, which seems like a win in a way for Netanyahu, but also a reprieve from Hezbollah, now really rechanges the regional calculus in a way that favors Turkey.
Yeah. So the events of the last few days in Syria really striking for anybody who has followed a story of the Syrian revolution. Aleppo, which at one point was the first city of Syria, and thanks to depopulation, is certainly now the second city. Aleppo is the heart of Syria's rebellion. And to see Aleppo retaken by Syrian rebels is an extraordinary and significant moment. But in some respect, it's quite easy to understand what has happened here. Bashar al-Assad, Syria's blood-stained dictator, had three key pillars to his rule. One was the Russian Air Force. The second was Iran and its range of proxy forces. And the third, very related to that, is Hezbollah, which in particular bolstered his infantry forces, fighters literally on the ground. If we think about the events of the last year and a half in the Middle East, it is very easy to understand how all of those three pillars have been distracted. Iran and Hezbollah by Israel's assault first on Gaza and then Lebanon in response, of course, to the October 7th massacre. For Russia, a different set of circumstances, their attention having been distracted by the war in Ukraine. So this gave an opportunity for Syria's rebels. And the thing about Syria's rebels, they had not been defeated. They remained in Idlib, which is a city just to the northwest of Aleppo. And in fact, they controlled a small, what we might call a statelet with 4 million people. So this was a significant piece of territory. So in that respect, the Syrian regime itself, Bashar al-Assad's own regime, had very limited power. It was very reliant on its allies, on outside support to keep it afloat. And so on one level, it is perhaps not surprising to see what has happened. But on another level, many people had, myself included, reached a point where we imagined that Bashar had won the civil war. What was your view, Jason?
I agree with the big picture tectonic plates that you have described, and the kind of mainstream media analysis is Russia's distracted in Ukraine. The Iranians are very scared that the Israelis will attack their nuclear or overthrow the regime. And Hezbollah, all the commanders are dead and there's no leadership. I want to look at it, though, in a different, more granular way, as you did in your excellent podcast with Thomas van Linge that we're going to have a link to in the show notes, which is that Bashar didn't win the Syrian civil war. Rather, Syria fragmented. As ISIS famously said, the Sykes-Picot line no longer exists, and that's because Syria is no longer a state. You had a Kurdish statelet in the northeast. You've had Turkish incursions and Turkish-backed militias in various parts of the north, but also Idlib, where the role of the Turks are very important with Jawlani, and he is the head of the Hayat Tahrir Sham group, which comes from an al-Qaeda-descended group, and Bashar was only in power in Damascus and the Environ and able to retake Aleppo because of Syrian and Hezbollah help, as you pointed out. So the point is that Syria never became a state again. Syria's stateness was destroyed in 2011, and that never came back, and therefore that it's more collapsed into a different mosaic checkerboard than before is maybe less surprising than one might imagine. Who's winning? And I say the Turks are winning. It so happened that a Turkish flag was planted in the citadel of Aleppo. And, that was the number 2 city of the Ottoman Empire when the Balkans fell, and its economic activity within the Ottoman Empire was so great. Obviously, there are many Turkic-speaking Ottoman officials and Turkish-speaking people there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So that's one big picture. And then did the Israelis, in pursuing this strategy they have done against Hezbollah, and then randomly, rapidly having this ceasefire, which I think it's because they have no strategy and have lost, just as they've lost in Gaza, and that's an unconventional take. Did they really understand that they've changed the regional balance of power in a way which may not be to their interest? The people that they have now helped to come into power are Sunni jihadis.
So let's start with Turkey, and I'm glad you mentioned them, because back in the days when HTS or its forebears were unambiguously aligned with al-Qaeda, there was very clear evidence that Turkey and also Qatar were giving them support. And that was a source of some controversy and anxiety. But more recently, HTS has kind of rebranded itself, has distanced itself from the very extreme Islamism. It has been seen to, for example, there are indigenous Christian communities in the areas it controls. It has been seen to help to restore churches, restore Christian communities to their traditional lands. And in that context, we see evidence that HTS is becoming more of a kind of pragmatic Arab nationalist movement rather than a extremist Islamist movement. And if we talk about Israel, there's another interesting story there. Now, back in the days when the forebears of HTS were seen as a very extreme movement, there were allegations that Israel was in some way aligned with it. Now, but what do I mean by that? I'm not suggesting for a moment that the Israeli state is aligned with extreme Islamism, but there were case studies of HTS or Jabhat al-Nusra, preceding entity, fighters crossing the border into Israel, receiving medical treatment under the guise of a sort of humanitarian program. But we shouldn't delude ourselves that the Israelis have any doubt about who they're dealing with, who they're treating. So I think there's a lot of complexity in this region because ultimately the fundamental question, do you want Bashar al-Assad to remain as dictator of Syria, is not as simple as it should be. At some points, both Western and Middle Eastern powers had a fairly universal view that Bashar al-Assad should go, that he was a negative influence on the region. But I think things have evolved. There's an argument in which actually the Israelis would see Assad hanging on in Syria to be to their advantage compared to a much more extreme version, which is a Sunni Islamist movement with half the country controlled by Hezbollah. So I think we're living in a very chaotic situation.
I want to look at this from another prism. Mm-hmm. Let's look at this from the Israeli-Lebanese prism and the larger regional war, which is the confrontation between Israel and the resistance, and Israel and its Gulfi allies and the West, and Iran and its allies. Obviously, Turkey plays an ambiguous role there. What I see is that what's going on now is proof of my thesis, and I articulated it on the pod in the second week of October 2023, which is that Israel had lost the war in Gaza as soon as Hamas made that incursion, and that no amount of settler violence on the one hand or killing of Hamas or Hezbollah leaders or even the destruction of the Houthi movement in Yemen would change that fact. And to me, this is proof because what terror does is that it creates a backlash, and that backlash radicalizes a subject population. And that's what 9/11 did, which is why the 9/11 was a success for Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is going to long outlive ISIS. And I see that we're now seeing those dynamics, and I think that Netanyahu is a tactician and not a strategist. He does everything to stay in power, and that's tactics. In other words, the Gaza war is prolonged this way, and he got this ceasefire with the Lebanese, and he used the good offices of Biden's envoy, Amos Hochstein, very effectively to say, look, I've made the ceasefire before Trump came in, and there's no strategy about what the region is and what the compromise that he wants. And therefore, if the Lebanese civil war had ended a certain way in the Ta'if Accords in the 1990s, and then the 2006 war with Israel had ended with Resolution 1701, and now this one, it's ending with a reinforcing of 1701 and the putting of UNFIL in just the same area south of the Litani River. And maybe the Lebanese army is going to fulfill some peacekeeping role, which they never did before.
So why would they now?
They don't have the capacity to do it. The Lebanese state is much weaker than it had been before the financial crisis. I want to use this to have an unconventional analysis, which is that the winner are the disordering powers. And if Turkey is a victor, and I think that they are, that's because they want regional disorder. And these other Sunni militants, it's the same. And I don't think that the Iranians are that unhappy that their client Bashar al-Assad has lost some territory.
When we look at the big picture in the region, and let us not forget that, of course, one of the major elements of the unresolved conflicts in the region is Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights. Now, one might say that's the easiest to resolve because I think Syria, they would never say this publicly, but I think they probably internally acknowledge that they're never getting it back. The commander of HTS, this rebel group, his nom de guerre is al-Jolani. And what he's doing there, Jolani being the Arabic name for the Golan, he is aligning himself as a Syrian. He's born and bred as a Syrian national. He's aligning himself with this idea that part of his country is under occupation by Israel. So what I'm saying there is that you cannot look at any of these individual conflicts in isolation, that everything is connected. And I guess, Jason, coming back to what you were talking about, these big picture questions, in a way, the biggest picture of all is the two-state solution, whether such a thing still exists. And of course, the triumph of a very nationalist kind of Likudnik politics in Israel has to some extent killed off the idea of a two-state solution. Now, most Western countries on paper still adhere to it. They say that the Palestinians must have their state, but nobody can really articulate how that would work. Nobody can articulate how the expanded settlement movement in the Palestinian territories could possibly cohere with a state that operates. And at this point, I find myself, and I'm almost surprised that I say this, thinking of Jared Kushner's peace plan. Now, at the time, so Jared Kushner, of course, President Trump's son-in-law, who in the first Trump term came up with a police plan that I think most people would regard as flagrantly unjust, one that really took no account of Palestinian interests, gave Israel everything it wanted. But on one level, if you have a rampant Israeli expansionist state, and the Palestinians have absolutely no serious advocate in the sort of global community, then actually, I just wonder whether the Kushner plan is at least something that can be implemented. Whereas we go back to earlier iterations of potential peace accords, nobody has any ability to implement those versions of a settlement.
Yes, Arthur, the past is a foreign country, and even things that looked very unjust and bad then look quite reasonable now. Obviously, the 1990s look like a dream relative to what has happened after. And so the Kushner plan looks better than what's happening now. But I want to push back on the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu is a coherent expansionist, meaning that they want to gobble up territory and they have some either economic or social or settler interests in this territory. That's too coherent. I think that there may be people on the Israeli right who want that. I don't see Netanyahu as that. All he wants is disorder. I mean, this is my analysis, because then he can stay in power. Yeah. And that explains why there is a complete lack of coherency in terms of when they stop the war or not in Gaza or in Lebanon, what settlers are allowed to make this outpost or that outpost. Yeah. When the Saudis could have been helping them in some ways, and the Qataris could have helped them get the hostages back, and there could be some kind of pan-Arab force to do reconstruction, and then maybe even policing in Gaza. These are things that even if you were a maximalist, you would want them, and then, you gobble up some territory or whatever. Yeah. But that's not what a disorderer is going to do. So when I'm putting forth this thesis, and I just don't think the Israelis can win based on any formulation of what their strategic goals might be, even a right-wing formulation.
So I guess the question there would be, if the Israelis decide to take a very aggressive, we could call it forward-leaning, whatever framing we use, but they say, we're going to annex the West Bank, we're going to resettle Gaza, maybe not all of Gaza, but some of Gaza. What you're saying is that even then they can't win.
Correct. That's my belief. That's my contention. Win makes no sense when we're talking also about hundreds of thousands of human lives potentially lost and millions displaced. So I hate using this term, given the tragedies on the Palestinian side, thousands killed on the Israeli side, the outburst of global anti-Semitism, which to my mind will only get worse as a result of any of these developments. But I still am saying win in the sense of we need to understand that it's not like Israel achieved a regional vision. And, oh my God, the tactical genius of the pager bombs. Right. And then, they decapitated Hezbollah. No one believed that Nasrallah could be killed. No one believed this, that, and the other. But they didn't even realize that this could lead to the rise of a Sunni jihadi statelet, not just in northern Syria, but an area larger than Israel.
After the break, we'll be talking about the elections, but also the extraordinarily national protests in the Republic of Georgia.
So to pivot from this to another part of the world that is very, very near and dear to my heart. And by the way, there's no place that we've discussed, whether it's the Aleppo citadel or the water wheels of Hama, or the souks of Lebanese Tripoli, or areas south of the Litani River in Tyre that I have not been. Obviously, I've been in all of these places. We're going to go to a place that I have spent even more time, and I remember even more fondly, which is Georgia. And its amazing capital city, Tbilisi, and the Grand Boulevard Rustaveli Avenue, named after their famous national poet, an area where I have eaten glorious soup dumplings. I have gone to many supras, and now we see water cannons being sprayed at pro-EU protesters and absolute pandemonium allowing Eastern European color revolution, all because the protesters say that the prior election was rigged and that the recent decision to cancel Georgia's EU accession process is anti-democratic and in violation of their laws and stuff. You recently did a pod on this. Yeah. Please tell us about the guests you had and what your takeaways were.
Yeah, so I was very privileged to speak to Marika Mariashvili. She is the Foreign Secretary of DRUA, which is one of a range of liberal and pro-European, pro-Western parties operating in Georgia.
The link is going to be in the show notes. It's very, very engaging.
Yeah, and Georgia is such an interesting country. For those that don't know it, it might be a small place, but it is, in civilizational terms, important. It is arguably the first nation that embraced Christianity in human history.
No, the Armenians would contest that, but even second is good enough.
For second, good enough. Where we're talking in thousands of years, it is definitely the place that gave the world wine, and I think we can all agree that is a great legacy. And so what we're looking at is a country that has an extremely clear understanding of itself, of its culture, of its history, and of its sense of being a European nation. And at the same time, it is under a concerted effort by Moscow, led literally from Russia's intelligence and security agencies, to try to dominate Georgia and to try to prevent it from becoming a member of the European Union. So the specific points of detail that are worth knowing is that Georgia recently held parliamentary elections. These were almost certainly fraudulent.
I want to interrupt there.
Yes.
Aspects of them may have been certainly fraudulent, meaning that there were cameras in voting booths, people were intimidated that they would have their subsidies, taken away from their community if they didn't vote for Georgian Dream. That the whole elections were or were not rigged is still subject for debate.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I think we're in agreement that the ruling party, the pro-Moscow party, was able to intimidate the population. Now, obviously, how one measures that is difficult, but the outcome is clear that the ruling party, the pro-Moscow party, claimed a victory, and then within hours of their claimed election victory, declared that Georgia would pause its attempts to join the European Union. Now, for Georgians, joining the European Union is a particular and almost universal aspiration. So the key point here is that you could be conservative, you could be liberal, you could be right or left, but there is a general sense that being in the EU would be an extremely positive development for Georgia.
And there was that universality, I would say, 10 years ago. But what has happened is a growth of conspiracy theories that,
yes,
for example, the EU and the West is based on homosexual ideology, and that they use NGOs to inflict on the youth LGBTQ plus ideology. And enough people believe that probably 10 or more % no longer aspire to EU membership. And then there's a range of other conspiracy theories, which is that if they would move closer to the EU, the Russians will move beyond South Ossetia and Abkhazia and gobble up more than 20% of the country. That, of course, is not proven to be true. There's lots of other conspiracy theories that have now, I would say, succeeded in eroding support for the EU as a neutral actor, but still 70-ish% of people want to join the EU.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to why Georgia is so unique, but then also why Georgia is resonating with developments in Belarus and Ukraine. So why is Georgia so unique? It is that it is demonstrably a sovereign entity, and people know if they are Georgian. Since the 3rd century AD, the Georgians have had their own alphabet, and they've been their own nation since the 4th century AD.
Yeah.
And their sovereignty is something that is difficult to wash away.
Yeah.
And yet, now there are these similarities with Belarus and Ukraine, which is that if we go all the way back to Maidan, what happened was a process was going on where Ukraine was trying to accede to the European Union, and a pro-EU leader wanted to make that happen. The Russians quashed that. An anti-EU leader, whether by a rigged election or fair election, came into power. He tried to cancel those things, more align himself with Russia, and there were street protests in the symbolic areas of the capital. And that's exactly what is happening now in Tbilisi. And then if we look at the Belarusian case, there was a disputed election, that one more obviously rigged, with Lukashenko saying that he got 80%. Absurd. Svetlana Tamaneskaya having to flee to Vilnius.
Yeah.
And huge popular protests where anyone who participated then was on a list and was pursued, and they lost their career and they were chased out to the Baltics and whatever.
Yeah.
And we could potentially see this happening in Georgia, which has been this pro-Western place that we have stood up for them since the Russians tried to occupy the north in 2008.
Yeah, so it's fascinating that the change that has occurred in Georgia. So just to illustrate this, in I think only 2018, I visited Georgia as a tourist with my family, with my young kids. And at that time, Russians were boycotting Georgia, encouraged to do so by Moscow. So Georgia went through a phase of a very pro-Western alignment. And then effectively, Moscow has struck back. And I think something that we see a lot in current geopolitics, that the West is easily distracted, and particularly Europe. Europe is easily distracted. It lacks the resources that match its economic might. And of course, Europe has been focused on Ukraine, rightly so. And effectively, we've let Georgia slightly drift. The Georgian Dream, which sounds lovely, Georgian Dream, the political party, but actually the Georgian Dream is a Moscow nightmare. It is the pro-Russian party in the Georgian setting. The Georgian Dream has regained control. There is a single billionaire oligarch of a kind that will be very familiar to listeners.
And I want to connect this to the global disorder because it is Elon Musk-esque. One oligarch who, through connections to the government, does self-dealing contracts, but then has relationships with other states, in this case Russia, but Elon is connected to so many others, then uses his connection to political leaders, and Ivanishvili essentially appoints the prime ministers, to then, through self-dealing, change the fundamental nature of the checks and balances of the democratic process.
Yes.
And let's talk about the protests now. So we mentioned water cannons, we mentioned lasers. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think one of the challenges that we see is that at a different time, you had a US administration, and I'm thinking all the way back to 2008.
W. Bush.
And W. Bush, that was very focused on Georgia, and at that time,
McCain in particular.
Yeah, and Saakashvili, who was an earlier president of that country, very Western aligned. He had allies in the White House, literally probably could pick up the phone to them. We're in a very different world now. Now, the EU clearly has an alignment and a sympathy with Georgia, but the EU is really on the ropes. The EU is trying to deal with Ukraine. And Georgia is not Ukraine. Georgia is a small country. Georgia is a country that is physically closer to Iran than it is to France. And this is, in a way, Georgia's tragedy, that it is culturally completely European, but it is geographically in a different place.
It's not culturally completely European. Obviously, Georgian cuisine has its Ottoman elements. They eat a kind of kebab. There's a pomegranate sauce that comes from Iran. They were conquered at different times by the Seljuks, by the Abbasids, and by the Ottomans. Due to their Christianity and view in both cases of themselves as white, they understand themselves as European. And as a result of history, they understand their culture as European. Now, Arthur, I want to get to the heart of the matter. If the people, with their people power, want to occupy Rustaveli Avenue, and they want to say, we're going to join the EU, but the regime has these police, and it says, well, we have the water cannon and the guns. You're not joining the EU because you didn't win the election. Who will win? And does it matter that the Georgian president herself is saying that the elections are rigged? Because it's going to be very difficult to demonstrate that when you have to use Georgian courts to litigate this case. So where does this leave us? Because I feel like we need to now bring the Georgian situation in juxtaposition with the South Korean one, which is that in South Korea, the reason why martial law couldn't be declared and he has to back down, the president there, Yoon, is because it's not possible in a South Korean context to fire into a crowd of similar South Koreans. They have the cultural norms and institutional norms that make it impossible to kill other South Koreans to stay in power. What about in Georgia, where people are going to get killed, and there are certain groups and certain struggles that may make it difficult to enforce the rule of law?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, one of the things that I'm just going to repeat what I was told by my interviewee in the podcast that I did, and I encourage listeners to seek that out if they're interested, is that actually Georgia has many histories of complexity and of democratic backsliding, but actually the Georgian police and security forces do not fire into crowds, so they do not carry out massacres. And ultimately, the question which we don't yet know the answer to, this has been unfolding very rapidly in the last less than a week, is whether or not the Georgian police and related security agencies will mete out extreme violence on their fellow citizens. Just as we saw in Ukraine, but actually in Egypt, a country that had no tradition of democracy, at a certain point, security forces may not be willing. So that I think there's something about humanity.
If there are no cleavages in Georgia, it's not only that there are different groups like Svans and there's Turkic minorities, but there are wild wealth inequalities, and there are urban, non-urban, elite, non-elite cleavages in a way that in South Korea, among a very educated, very homogenous populace, in a way with a Gini coefficient, which is the inequality coefficient, much better than the US or UK, it's extremely difficult for a South Korean guy to kill another one. Whereas on Georgia, I don't know. I could see that the disorder, they are now having a culture war. And it can play out in fracturing Georgia in the way that we've seen elsewhere. Whereas if we want to bring it back to the South Korean parallel, it doesn't work. You can't turn South Koreans against each other because, no, their thing is too strong.
Yeah, and I think that the important difference here is that the major element in the Georgian context is Moscow. And Moscow, whatever we think of Putin and the Kremlin, what they have a particular genius in is political interference, particularly in the post-Soviet state, so that they will be particularly sophisticated. For example, Georgia, as we've already alluded, is a traditionally Christian society, so questions around diverse sexualities are hot button questions. And that is a way that you can divide the society. So there are lots of elements which the Russian interference machine, the disinformation machine, can play on. And Russians will have literally centuries of expertise about interfering in Georgia because that is the history.
So we get to this point. Georgia is very connected to Russia.
Yes.
Way similar to Ukraine, where people have family members in the two places. They cross back and forth.
In a way that you couldn't say of Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan.
100%.
Yeah.
What happens now? I don't see a West which is capable of really standing up for Georgia.
I agree.
And this is a stealth coup. In other words, it's a power grab. Whether the election would have been won by Georgia Dream if they played entirely straight, I can't say. But what now?
One of the big questions, so it came out in the podcast that I did, is will the EU lead the way in raising targeted sanctions? And to some extent, there's lots of debate about the efficacy of sanctions. But the point is really about an economic bloc that for Georgians is important, including Georgians who are aligned with Moscow. If they cannot operate in an EU context, that will have an impact. So that's a start. I'm not saying that will cause them to back down, but that is a way that the EU can show its hand early and quickly. Now, one of the problems we have, and these are boring administrative problems, the EU has just switched over its commission. So Kaja Kallas, former Prime Minister of Estonia, clearly somebody who has a very strong personal story in relation to Moscow interfering in its neighborhood. But she's only just been appointed. So things like this will hold up the degree to which the EU is willing to act. Similarly, President Biden, in the last few days of his presidency, I'm sure he feels a strong sense of allegiance with Georgian Democrats. But of course, without taking a political position on Trump, even if you take a positive view of Trump as a sort of pragmatic, ruthless operator in foreign affairs, there's no reason for him to get involved with Georgia. There's nothing in it.
No, there's nothing in it for him that he may want the Russians to win there. So it's why I'm not optimistic.
Yeah.
So this question of disorder and how everything is actually connected allows us to come to a topic that I never thought I would discuss, the Irish elections.
Oh, yes.
Many people outside of the British Isles will not even be aware that there was an Irish election. In looking into this Irish election, what blows my mind is it's exactly the same as British and American elections. The major issues are cost of living, housing crisis, immigration reform, and the failure of the existing healthcare system. It sounds like it could be a British election. And the reason why that's important is it's all the same cultural themes that one of the parties ran saying Ireland is full and that they don't want more immigration. Where have we heard that before? And an irony that I need to toss out before getting your thoughts, Arthur, as someone who's grown up closer to these Irish issues, is Ireland is one of the few Western and developed countries that had more population in 1860 than it does now.
And of course, any British person one of the strange things about growing up British is that, particularly if you're of my generation, you grew up in the 80s, unfortunately, Ireland was caricatured and targeted as a terrorist state, as a place that full of militancy and so on. And yet, very few people really understand that the rather simple fact that Ireland is an independent country. It's independent as a result of centuries of British occupation and exploitation, and it's been independent now for roughly 100 years.
And their economy is stronger than the British economy, so that despite the British patrimonialism and condescension towards Ireland, which Margaret Thatcher was famous for, but I would say has even persisted till this day, the Irish have nailed globalization, free trade, and inclusion in the EU, and they're a model that Britain should look up to rather than condescending to the Irish.
Totally. And again, if you grew up in my generation, you were accustomed to the idea that all Irish people were simpletons. Well, it turns out that these simpletons not only ran globally significant universities and businesses, but when the British were stupid enough to adopt Brexit, the Irish saw a huge opportunity and drew in a lot of global businesses that had previously headquartered in London. But what's very interesting about Irish politics, and I think this is partly a function of a post-colonial environment, is that Irish politics traditionally has been very unideological. So you have Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, the two great parties of Ireland, and their differences are located in the politics of Ireland's independence struggle rather than in the politics of Ireland post-independence. Now, what's very interesting about the most recent years in Ireland is the emergence of Sinn Féin. Now, for those of us, again, who are sitting in Britain, we think of Sinn Féin as something to do with the IRA. But if you're sitting in the Republic of Ireland, Sinn Féin's role is as a left-wing, what one might call a populist left-wing movement, analogous to Bernie Sanders, maybe Jeremy Corbyn. Those are the analogies. So Ireland's politics, in some respects, are, as you identified, Jason, very similar to others in the Western world, but in other respects quite unusual, because you've had a domination of two parties that are very much associated with Ireland's story.
And if I could interject, it's critical to say that Sinn Féin adopted a quasi-open borders policy that then they were forced to reverse to bring in their working class supporters just before the election. And if you think about some of the mistakes that the Biden and Harris campaign made, it was that they understood that America needed more workers, just as the Irish have understood. They also came from the left and were in the traditionally working class supporting party. They adopted a pro-migrant stance that they then had to back down on, and therefore they were not able to face off the neo-populists because of their own actions.
And I think the other thing that is very interesting about Irish politics is its relationship with global finance. So Ireland, it's obviously an English-speaking country. It's a country that has a very liberal economy and has
a very neoliberal economy.
Neoliberal. I think that's right. And it has successfully marketed itself as a good place for global businesses to have a European headquarters. And this has only increased after the disaster of Brexit. So it was always that, but it increased more. And one of the big debates in this election campaign is literally how to spend it, how to spend a huge tax rebate, which originally the Irish government had allowed tax exemptions to huge global software firms, firms like Apple and so on. And the European court had reversed those decisions. So the Irish government is very unusual for a Western government to be in the position where they had money that they didn't want to have.
And they got the $14 billion tax windfall following the resolution of Apple's EU tax dispute.
There you go. So if you're in Britain or France or Germany, the debate is only about how can the government get money. In Ireland, the debate is what do we do with the money we never wanted? And that is, in a way, reflects Ireland's very unusual story. And as you say, that the population of Ireland now, in spite of a fairly liberal period of immigration policy and a thriving economy, is smaller than it was in the 19th century, thanks in part to the poverty that was imposed on it by a kind of imperial domination by the British. And of course, many Irish departed Ireland, went to North America and other places.
Speaking of the Irish, we have to think about the world's most famous person of Irish descent, and that is Joe Biden. Biden has governed as an Irishman, but he's also governed as someone who's plain speaking, plain talking. I'm going to quote Yeats in one of my speeches. I digress about this, and then I do that, but I am true to my working class Scranton roots,
Yeah.
man of his own word.
And I'll never forget the imagery of Joe Biden visiting the office of the Irish president. And it felt like two relatively old men bonding in a very kind of natural way. This wasn't like a protocol visit. It was two old guys having a chat.
Going to the pub, having their Guinness.
Pretty much.
But we digress. What I was going to say in terms of the importance of Biden's Irishness and plain speaking and just a man of his own word.
Yeah.
He said he wouldn't step down. Then he stepped down. He said Hunter Biden hadn't done these crimes. There was really nothing going on there. He wasn't going to have to pardon him because there was nothing to pardon. He then said, bizarrely, after losing the election, that he wasn't going to pardon Hunter Biden. And then, at the start of December, he pardons his son for crimes against the United States. It implies in a bizarre way that he might have done those crimes. And it also implies that the Burisma affair, which connects Ukraine to the very heart of everything that is corrupt in the American political system, and the connection to being on a Chinese board, that there's other stuff going on here. Forget about the drug and the gun offenses, which are not politically relevant. So that is really, I think, going to be one of the legacies that really, really sucks. He wasn't bold enough to face down Trump and make Merrick Garland and make the courts do everything to get Trump on treason, but he was bold enough to go back on his own word to pardon his son.
Yeah. Well, I think there's been, lots of discussion and debate about this case. As far as I can understand, the origins of the Hunter Biden ultimately victimization by the US justice system comes in either the Trump era or Trump appointed officials. And of course, what we also know is that if you are Joe Biden, you know that you've got days left as president and that President Trump is incoming. You know that a complete weaponization and victimization of completely upstanding citizens is baked in.
Of course. I mean, you wouldn't want to be Merrick Garland or Jack Smith, let alone Scaramucci.
This is real. I mean, people who have held very senior offices in the US system are planning their exit.
Right. But because we were going to have to get to this point,
Yeah.
you should have seen it coming and we should have attacked. And I have always said the only way to fight unscrupulous neopopulism is to be so cunning that you out-cunning them. Maybe you don't want to be unscrupulous, but we need to be more cunning than to say we're not going to pardon him and then we pardon him. And maybe it's fair to pardon him because Trump is going to just trump up the charges anyway. And then we're going to make a whole political racket over this. But how could you pardon your son and then not succeed in getting Trump and his people on all of their own foul deeds, which are so much worse?
Well, I think that the role of Merrick Garland will come to be seen in history as a very unimpressive one. Because Merrick Garland, let us not forget, he should be on the Supreme Court. His qualifications for that role were undoubted. President Obama nominated him in contradiction of the Constitution. Mitch McConnell refused to initiate the hearings to put Garland on the Supreme Court. And when Biden appointed him as Attorney General, a lot of people, myself included, felt, well, this is a kind of vindication. This is a guy who should be a Supreme Court justice, but he'll be a great Attorney General. Well, he wasn't a great Attorney General. He was incredibly cautious. He slow-pedaled everything.
They were so afraid of being seen to be partisan that they weren't even doing things by the book legitimately. They were so cautious. And now, because we know the other side is going to be so partisan, we're in this huge jam. And the question, Arthur, is where does this leave us to order the disorder? Connecting the Biden pardon, the protests in Georgia and South Korea, and then the military developments in the Levant and Ukraine.
It's a tough ask, but I think there's a basic point here, which is the thing we haven't touched on yet, but let's just briefly touch on it, which is the parade of egregiously unqualified appointments that Trump is pushing up for his cabinet. An attorney general who's barely a lawyer. I mean, admittedly, that guy has stood back Matt Gaetz, but we've still got a drunkard sex abuser, Pete Hegseth, who wants to.
He may be taken off as well.
He may be taken off. We've got Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, there is a point here that if you appoint flagrantly unqualified people to very hard jobs, the basic issue here is that being Secretary of Defense for America at a time of global conflict is a very hard job. So I think two things may unfold. One is that the inadequacy of Trump's people will become clear very quickly. I think the other thing is that if the inclination of the Trump administration to autocracy can be limited by the norms that exist in US society, and let us not forget that even when Trump was president, his attempts to steal the election in 2020 failed because actually the norms, the military were not willing to mount a coup. The election administrators in Pennsylvania were not willing to.
And this is a critical point because it shows that where you have culture and solidarity, you can have institutions that work. And in some aspects, America is closer to South Korea.
Yeah.
And in other aspects, it may be closer to the Republic of Georgia. And that's the way I like to look at this lens is the metric of state capacity.
Yeah.
If we looked at countries that did really great with the pandemic, like South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they tended to have a lot of solidarity, and they're religiously. Keep in mind, Israel was actually quite good at the pandemic because of the solidarity that exists there in various groups.
Yeah.
And ones that were more libertarian or not so great at state capacity, for example, like the UK and US, as well as others sprinkled around the world, tended to do worse at the pandemic. And I see that this challenge from global disorder is like a challenge from the pandemic. If you have state capacity and solidarity among citizens, which, for example, in Sweden or in Norway, they're very good at it, they may respond better. We don't know where the US stands. Where is our state capacity? And we don't know where it is in Georgia either. So we're just kind of waiting to see all these little controlled experiments. And I think looking at it from that 30,000-foot view helps me order the disorder, which is to see that the Georgians may, because of their desire to be European, because of their long tradition of sovereignty, they may actually do quite well, and we shouldn't count them out.
Yeah, totally. And equally, in 2026, because Trump insists on appointing unqualified people, and because ultimately he's not serious about the boring things that matter to governments, it may be that actually he loses big in the midterms, as he did back in 2018 in his first presidency.
However, it's important to point out that when we're doing 2026 electoral map, the Senate seats that are going to be coming up quite favor the Republicans. The map, as it was in 2018, is favorable in the Senate, although not in the House. And it's just today, as we're recording, a few days before this podcast airs, that the last congressional seat in California has come in, which there was a win for the Dems in actually flipping a seat. And if you look at the 2026 House map, it could be quite favorable. But yes, how the disorder plays out and how it's ordered may have a lot to do with the institutional and cultural strengths and solidarities. And I wouldn't count the Georgians out to actually get rid of Ivanishvili because dictators and autocrats made mistakes of overreach. And Ukraine was an overreach. Belarus and canceling the election there may not have been an overreach because Putin was still on the ascendant. They called the EU's bluff there. I don't know if what's going on in Georgia may be calling the bluff of the West, or if we're going to be able to help out, or just the resiliency of the Georgian people will turn out to be like that of the South Korean people, which is that if you try to crack down on protesters, you get turfed out.
Absolutely. And that's what we saw in South Korea, where an attempted coup lasted just a matter of hours. It's a reminder that in, I won't say established, but democracies that have a measure of establishment, which I think is appropriate to describe South Korea and also Georgia, it can go both ways. And if you overstep, the response of a motivated populace may push you back, and the military may not be willing to back you up.
And to end on a positive note, the key factor may be state capacity and cultural solidarity. So, Arthur, it's been so much fun chatting through these topics with you. Tell the listeners more about how they can follow your podcast, get your content.
Well, thank you, Jason. My podcast, Behind the Lines with Arthur Snell, is available in all the places you can find podcasts. And also, if you're interested in the related topics, please have a look at my Substack, Arthur Snell, also known as Not All Doom, because not everything that's going on is doom at the moment.
A lot of it is disorder, but not doom.
Yeah. And I'm there online. Please check it out.
As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer-in-chief, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. Check out the Substack that goes with this podcast for lots of the content that Arthur has mentioned and bits and bobs about Ireland, Georgia, Ukraine, NATO, all the fun stuff. We are wishing you this week full of state capacity and orderliness that could, for example, renationalize rail. Without further ado, next week we're going to have a very exciting episode on Canada. You might think that Canada is all orderly. It is not. There's a lot of disorder lurking there. It's going to be really fun talking to Justin Trudeau's former top aide, Marcy Sirks.
And then I'm going to come back with Jane Kinnenmont, my favorite Glaswegian expert. And she and I are going to chat just about Syria and our life experiences there on Thursday. So we're going to have a bonus episode where we really delve beyond the headlines.
Bye for now.